absolutely classic featherweight fight there between Nick Ball and Brandon Figueroa for the WBA Featherweight Championship of the World. Brandon Figueroa winning by a miraculous 12th round knockout that I most certainly did not see coming, although, to be honest, this fight ending in knockout is the way that it seemed like it was going to end for a while. This was a very bruising, punishing fight where both guys were really refusing to back up from their offensive game plans from moment one. It was very powerful, appealing counterpunching from Nick Ball and very aggressive, forward-moving, constant pressure. Think about Sebastian Hernandez against Junto Nakatani last month in that controversial fight. The work that he did, very similar style from Brandon Figueroa here, moving forward, switching stances, both fighters switching stances. These really are two of the best fighters in this weight range in the world, and it's a shame this fight was actually only for one belt. You know, there's obviously a crowded situation at featherweight, but it would have been nice if there would have been more than one belt on the line. This fight could have deserved to be a unification fight. I think Figueroa has proved himself to be that level of fighter. Taking a fighter like Nick Ball's zero is not insignificant in the slightest, although this was a little bit too hard of a matchup for Ball. It was a mandatory. This was not a fight Ball could have said no to. He would not have been able to keep his WBA belt, and I fully expected this as a home fight to be scored like a Nick Ball home fight. I think that if Ball would have been able to get through the last round, which ultimately I think was really just a matter of luck, of not getting hit by a big shot from Hernandez, because they were both going hell for leather in the last round. That was the kind of fight this was always going to be. So it really shouldn't be surprising that this fight ended in a KO. But I was watching this fight and just thinking, man, how are they scoring this? That's really how I was watching this fight, because I was having a really hard time scoring this fight. I was sitting there actually writing my scores down with a pencil and paper round by round. I just felt like doing that, sitting here watching the fight. It's a freezing day outside. So I was just watching this fight that I've been looking forward to. I decided, okay, fine, like I'll keep score. But regardless, I was having a hell of a time trying to score this fight, because it was a matter of, do you prioritize the volume work from Figueroa or the explosive headshots coming back the other way from Nick Ball? Because a big part of the problem with this fight, although not really a problem, it was a great fight to watch, was that the shorter fighter in Ball was delivering the big power shots to the head of Figueroa, and Figueroa was delivering volume work mostly to the body of Ball. And a lot of time in that way, the punch angles can be a lot more obvious to a shorter fighter in boxing, especially with a height difference like this. And that's what I was saying. This was an insanely hard fight for Nick Ball to take, and there was a significant risk of him losing his zero in this fight, I think more so than the odds reflected. Because Figueroa is 5'9", which is very, very tall for a featherweight in boxing. And Ball, of course, very short at 5'2", which is about the closest thing to a peekaboo fighter that we have in modern boxing, although I wouldn't call him necessarily a peekaboo fighter, but that high guard that you see from Nick Ball, very similar to fighters like Mike Tyson or Floyd Patterson. A big part of the reason why I scored a lot of this fight, a lot of the rounds in this fight for Ball, when I think a lot of people would have scored them for Figueroa, is because a lot of those pitter-patter volume punches from Figueroa were just hitting off the gloves. And he was just finding Ball's gloves more often than he was finding any other part of Nick Ball. Although he was able to find hooks to the body and punches to the body consistently, Figueroa, because of his height difference. But I was frustrated with Figueroa in the middle rounds of this fight, because I thought that he did himself a disservice switching to southpaw. I get that he wanted to give Ball a different look, and that maybe that was obviously a big part of why he ended up getting the knockout in the 12th round. He got the knockdown from a bit of a switch stance, but a southpaw stance definitely, and it was a big overhand left that floored Ball. Not an overhand left, but a hook, a very sharp hook, a very sharp left hook that floored Nick Ball, so a left hand from the southpaw stance. But for many, many rounds, I think he was very comfortable, actually, in the first few rounds, Figueroa tagging Ball from the orthodox stance from the outside, and he did himself a bit of a disservice and lost control of the fight through the middle rounds by going to that southpaw stance. Ultimately, it paid off for Figueroa in that it enabled him to get a knockout in one of those unpredictable, hectic exchanges that there were so many of in this fight. But the tempo of this fight was very unpredictable, but very up-tempo, very fast. But it was one hell of a fight to watch, an extremely entertaining fight to watch. I think that if I were to watch it again, I would score it a different way. I'm heartbroken for Nick Ball, but he's extremely short for the weight. He has a very unconventional style, and he just fights war after war after war. So he's always going to be there for entertainment. He's always going to have a fan base. But this was a tough, tough fight for Nick Ball, and it would have been a hell of a fight to come through and win, and a really great, if perhaps in the future underrated chapter in the career of Nick Ball as he continued his career undefeated. But now it's got to be back to the drawing board, maybe even chasing a rematch for this belt, or who knows what's in the future for Nick Ball. But he's a great matchup for absolutely anybody, and hopefully, somebody like Anoya Inoue will look at Nick Ball and say, hey, that's a bit easier of a matchup now that he's taken a loss, now that there's a way through, because I've wanted to see that fight for a long time. But this was ultimately too big of a challenge for Nick Ball against a larger, game-hungry, pressure-fighting opponent. But to me, this takes absolutely nothing at all away from Nick Ball, and I don't think that, people say, oh, he didn't look great in the Goodman fight, and I think that he didn't look as good as I expected him to in the Goodman fight. I think he looked a lot better in this fight, actually. I think Figueroa is a much harder opponent, a much worse style matchup for Ball. And Ball definitely landed the better punches in this fight, other than the one that really counted, other than the one that ended the fight. And he actually did a really good job defending himself, all things considered. And I think an underrated aspect of Figueroa's game plan is that he didn't throw much to the head. As Ball was tired later in the fight, I think maybe the fact that he hadn't taken too many shots upstairs made him actually a little more vulnerable to such a big hook upstairs, and not seeing a big hook like that coming, because he was so used to the work coming to the chest, the work coming to the body. Well, that work coming to the chest and to the body had ultimately tired Nick Ball out. And Nick Ball looked tired in this fight a lot sooner than he usually does in his fights, and I think his counterpunching was amazing to see from a guy who isn't really thought of as a counterpuncher. It's something that I often compare Nick Ball to Mike Tyson, just stylistically. And that was an underrated part of Tyson's game as well, his ability in later rounds, or just in general, to counterpunch. And Nick Ball showed off his counterpunching in this fight, but the reason he had to show off his counterpunching is because he was tired. He was tired from all the body work that Figueroa did, really wire to wire. And it made the fight really, really hard to score, because I found myself basically questioning, okay, was the work from Ball appealing enough for it to overrule the constant volume from Figueroa? And you basically have to go and take it on a case-by-case basis, on a round-by-round basis. And that's how I approach scoring the fight. And that's why I say I think if I watched it back again, I would score it in a completely different way. Well, that was another impressive win for Figueroa. It looks right now like that Stephen Fulton matchup was just a style nightmare for him. It's not surprising for a Mexican pressure fighter to run into a slick American counterpuncher like Stephen Fulton and maybe have a hellish mismatch against him as a pressure fighter. I think there are a lot of pressure fighters who would have bad matchups against Stephen Fulton. That's kind of Stephen Fulton's deal. It's not really Nick Ball's deal, and Figueroa forced Ball to counterpunch. He forced the champion out of his comfort zone, and definitely didn't let Ball move forward, and definitely didn't let Ball be the aggressor really at all in any round. And that is something that's really, really new for a Nick Ball fight, just like the result. And it's a heartbreaking first loss, I think, because I think if he would have made it through that round as the champion fighting at home, I have no doubt the cards would have favored him. In fact, my cards did favor him. I had him up around, not that it matters, but I had him up around going into the last round. Then I scored the last round 10-8, of course, for Figueroa, giving Figueroa. It would be a 114 to 113 win for Figueroa. But that's not how they score fights. Figueroa wins KO 12. And going into the last round, I had it 105, 104. The close, I had actually 1, 5, 8, and 9, all recorded as close rounds. Although I remember thinking 10 and 11 were close. Although I actually gave rounds 9, 10, 11, and ultimately 12 to Figueroa. I gave most of the middle of the fight after that stance switch to southpaw from Figueroa to Ball. But that was one of the better title fights I've seen in recent memory. A crazy back and forth fight. A crowd at the beginning that sounded ready to go. And right as soon as Ball couldn't really get on the front foot, the crowd was a little quieter, and they really could only make the noise they wanted to make when Ball would land those counter punches. But Figueroa would always so quickly be back on the front foot, they wouldn't be able to stay loud. And I think that was a big part of why Figueroa wanted the crowd quiet, and he just kept moving forward and ultimately when they said his name at the end of the fight and handed him the belt, with Ball walking back to the dressing room looking worse for wear. But the crowd was completely quiet, and he did a phenomenal job of quieting that crowd all night long with his pressure fighting. But that was a great, unique style matchup, and one of the better fights that I've seen in a while. One of the better fights I've seen this year, and one of the more unpredictable fights, round to round and moment to moment, that I can remember seeing. So put some respect on Ball versus Figueroa in the future, because that was a pretty great fight, and I would love to see a rematch, actually. I think Figueroa really who deserves a significant boost here from this win, because it makes the rest of his resume. Not that it wasn't already impressive and deep. So many 12-round fights, so many championship fights. He's already a 3-division world champion now, if you can believe that after this. So even if this is the first Brandon Figueroa fight you've ever watched, or the first time you've heard his name, this is not the first time he's been relevant. Victories over Luis Nery, Carlos Castro, Joet Gonzalez, Jesse Magdaleno. And this is his first time fighting outside of, not outside of Texas. He fights a lot in Texas, Figueroa, but this is his first time fighting outside of the United States in Liverpool in a road fight. And he defeats an undefeated current world champion. And his current only losses still, Figueroa, as I said earlier, to Stephen Fulton. So that was a very fun fight here on a cold Saturday afternoon. It can't possibly be as cold in Liverpool as it is here on the East Coast here in the 212. It is absolutely frigid. Has to be under zero wind chill. It's 7 degrees with 20-mile-an-hour winds. So wish us all luck and survival here on the East Coast. And I will see you next time for more boxing and combat sports content. Leave a like, leave a sub, and keep coming back for more. That was an absolute banger of a fight. I feel honestly pretty devastated for Nick Ball.